Today we are continuing with chapter 14, coordination and control, and we'll be starting off with studying the reflex arc. So the reflex arc is the pathway that the nerve impulse travels to bring about a reflex action. A reflex action is a rapid and automatic response to a stimulus, right? So there are two things: it's rapid and it is automatic. So it occurs very quickly and it is not in your control, right? Many reflex actions occur, right? For example, if there's a dust particle that touches your eye and you start blinking, you cannot stop yourself from blinking in that situation, right? After some thought, maybe you can, but not immediately. If food or water goes to your windpipe, you start coughing, that is a reflex action, right? The size of the pupil of your eye changing depending on the light around you, that is a reflex action. You immediately pulling your hand away from a hot object, that is a reflex action. Or maybe something that is causing you discomfort, like someone pricks you with a pin or an ant bite or something, and you immediately react. All of those are reflex actions, right? So the reflex action travels through the nervous pathway that is called a reflex arc. Now this is demonstrated generally by the knee-jerk response. And what the knee-jerk response is that they take, a rubber hammer, and I don't know if you've ever gone for a checkup and the doctor's done this with you. And what they do is that they tap it below your kneecap. And so what that does is it, causes the muscle to it sends a signal, right? So it will cause your thigh muscle to contract, and the lower part of your leg will swing forward. So the pathway for this is like this, right? So they're showing the muscle over here, right? You tap the tendon, it sends a signal, it comes back, it has an effect on your thigh muscle, and you move it forward. More generally, right, whether it's the arm or the leg, this is what it looks like. So this particular illustration, you have a stimulus, right? So something that's detected, whether from the outside or the inside, right? The external or the internal environment. Internal meaning inside the body, and right, that is picked up by the sensory neuron. So it's picked up by the receptor first, and then it's transferred to the sensory neuron, right? So for example, the stretch receptor over here, you tap the tendon, it activates the stretch receptor. That stretch receptor transfers that stimulus to the sensory neuron. The sensory neuron takes it to the spinal cord. So that's where this is happening, right? And the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system. So not everything needs to go to the brain, although in this case it is going to the brain, right? But what's immediately happening is the sensory neuron goes into the spinal cord. Over there, it interacts. There's a synapse between the spinal cord and the motor neuron. So that's a direct interaction, right? You don't have a relay neuron coming in between. So the sensory neuron transfers that impulse directly to the motor neuron, and then the motor neuron from the spinal cord takes it back to the effector, which is the muscle fiber, and that causes a reflex response, right? So whatever kind of, wherever this reflex response is happening, whether it's change of the size of your pupil or the blinking or the coughing, that is where the receptor is. That's where the sensory neuron is getting the impulse from the receptor. It's taking it to the spinal cord, and then the motor neuron is causing the coughing or the blinking, or your hand to move away from the hot object, or whatever it is that's the reflex is. So this is something that they ask a lot of questions about, particularly in MCQs, but in paper 2 as well for the theory. So this pathway is something you know, and then they ask you, oh well, what if the sensory neuron is damaged? What if the motor neuron is damaged? right? What's going to happen then? So, right, a concept that they test time and again in your papers. Now, if you just read through this part of the text, right, so the pathway of this reflex arc is shown, which we've seen. Hitting the tendon stretches the muscle and stimulates the stretch receptors. So, right, talked about that. It sends an impulse to the sensory fiber that takes it to the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the sensory fiber passes the impulse across the synapse to the motor neuron, which takes it back to the thigh muscle, and then, right, the muscle contracts and your foot moves forward. Right, so the lower part of your limb moves forward. Now, the thing is that you are aware that is happening. You know that your leg is moving forward, and that means that the impulse is reaching your brain. So just because it's going to the spinal cord does not mean it's not going to the brain. So the reflex is being conducted through the spinal cord. The information is reaching your brain, and that's why you are aware that this is happening. You just can't do anything about it, right? So when this happens, the knee-jerk response, you cannot stop it from happening, right? Consciously. So I've pulled up a video. Let me just put it on screen for you, and we can view it together.
Hello everyone, my name is Rachel and today I'm going to be walking you through how to perform a knee jerk reflex. So you don't need any materials for this exercise, you just need a chair. And for this activity it's very important that your legs are dangling freely and that they're not touching the floor. If you want to use a spoon to test your knee jerk reflex, you're more than welcome to, but you're also able to use the side of your hand. So the next step is once you're sitting comfortably and relaxed, you're just gonna tap the spot right below your kneecap, and then your foot will jerk out, and that is your knee jerk reflex.
Okay, so you saw that her foot was moving forward. Did you notice that?
Yeah.
Right? That is the knee-jerk response. And that is involuntary, that is a reflex response, even though she is very much conscious. She is doing it herself with her own hand, but she cannot stop the knee from jerking. She cannot stop her foot from moving forward. Okay? So that is a knee-jerk reaction, and right, that is a reflex action. Now coming back to the book.
Uh, I also did that right now, like I could do that before.
You tried it right now and didn't happen? That's what you're saying?
I did.
Well,
Yeah.
like she said, you need to sit relaxed and you need to sit on a platform where your legs are dangling. So they're not touching the
Yeah.
floor and they are not touching any footrest. So they should be dangling in air. You should be relaxed and then you should try. Maybe you're not hitting it in the right spot. Maybe you're not hitting it hard enough. Right? You could ask someone else to tap below your kneecap with a spoon. See if that happens. If you're not able to have
Okay.
that, and if it's still not happening, you might want to go and get it checked by a doctor, right? Because this is the yeah, this is a sign of a healthy nervous system.
Okay.
Right? So if it's not happening, I hope it does happen, right? So this is usually done by doctors as a preliminary test to check whether your nervous system is working properly or not. Okay, so the sequence of events for a simple reflex arc are shown over here. There's a stimulus, right, which is detected by the receptor, which passes it on to the sensory neuron, which goes to the spinal cord, where it's transferred to the motor neuron, which sends the impulse to the effector, and then you get a response. Right? This flowchart is something that you would want to remember. Right? Not the part where it's saying below the kneecap. That's particularly for the knee jerk response, right? And the extension muscle for the leg and everything, but the overall concept. So they might give you some other situation. So it might not be the knee-jerk response. Could be, but not necessarily. Okay. Now, the special thing about sensory cells is that they're able to convert one form of energy to the other. Right? So for example, the eyes detect light energy, but our nerve impulses are in the form of electrical impulses. And so they're able to convert light to electrical energy. The ears detect sound vibrations, but they convert it to electrical energy. And so it could be chemical, it could be mechanical. So we detect someone holding our hand, so that is mechanical, right? Pressure sensors and everything. So our nervous system is able to convert energy being received from the stimuli of many different types into electrical energy. Okay. So when a receptor responds to a stimulus, it sends a nerve impulse to the brain, which makes us aware of the sensation. All right. Okay. So now we're moving on to talking about sense organs, and our primary focus will be the eye. Okay, so a sense organs are groups of receptor cells responding to specific stimuli such as light for the eye, sound for the ear, touch for the skin, temperature for the skin as well, and chemicals also for the skin and others. Right? Now, over here, they've explained the different parts of the eye and what they do in text. You can read through that. Right? An interesting thing over here is that the pupil looks black. Right? No, not the color of the eye. No, not the surrounding part. The pupil looks black because all the light entering the eye is absorbed by the black pigment in the part of the eye that's called the choroid. Okay. And I believe, yes, over here, this is important. So details of functions of the sclera, conjunctiva, humerus, choroid, and tear glands are not a syllabus requirement. So just keep that in mind. When you're reading this, the reason I'm not going to detail over here is because it has many things mentioned that you kind of don't need to know. Okay, so those details are not required. However, they are included here to put parts seen in the diagram of the eye in context. So this is the diagram of the eye. Most of this you don't need to know. You need to know the lens. You need to know the iris, right? So this thing that's in front of the lens, right? The ciliary body over here that's connecting the lens, the ciliary muscle, the ligaments that are holding the lens in place. So these thread-like things that you're seeing, right? You have the pupil in front of the lens, and you have the cornea, you have the retina at the back. There's this part called the fovea, where the most of your light receptors are, and color receptors are, concentrated. And then you have your optic nerve, and right in front of the optic nerve on the retina is what's called the blind spot. And that's because this part has no receptors for light, and so any part of an image that's formed that's hitting your blind spot, it's not going to be detected because it doesn't have any receptors over there. Okay, so the parts,
And,
yeah.
and like what happened to those like whose eyes turn like gray?
Whose eyes turn gray?
Yeah, the lens like and they cannot see like properly.
I mean, it could be glaucoma, it could be cataract, it could be something else. I don't know exactly, but obviously something's going wrong with some part of the eye.
Yeah.
Okay, now, right, the parts and the functions of the eye that you need to know are given in this table. So let's just go through them, and then we'll take a look at those again. I've already mentioned these. So right, you take a look, and so in all of this, you need to identify the parts that are given in the table. Okay, So first of all, you have the cornea. So the cornea is the covering outside the eye. This thing over here, this white bulge is the cornea. Okay, it is a transparent curved layer at the front of the eye that refracts the light, which means it bends the light that is entering the eye to help and focus it on the retina. So that's the internal layer where all your receptors are, right? So it focuses on the retina. The iris, right, is a colored ring. So the eye color, right? Someone's eyes are brown, someone's are black, blue, green, gray, whatever, right? And so that's a colored ring. So that's the iris actually of circular and radial muscles that change the size of the pupil, controlling how much light enters, right? So when there's bright light, the pupil contracts to minimize the light entering. When there's low light, the pupils dilate, and so it becomes, wider to allow maximum light to enter. And we'll take a look at that. So the iris is right this part over here, is sort of gray out right in front of the lens. Then you got the lens itself. It is a transparent, convex, flexible, jelly-like structure that refracts light to focus it into the retina. Then you got the retina, so that's the layer over here, that bluish layer that you can see. And it is a light-sensitive layer made up of rods which detect low light, right, light of low intensity, and cones which detect different colors, right? So they've got two different types of receptors. One are called rods, and the function of rods is to detect light of low intensity. And the other type of receptors are called cones, and they detect color, right? So they're different receptors and they have different functions, and both of them are present on the retina. And on the retina, let's talk about the fovea, a central part of the retina where the cones are most concentrated to detect colored light, right? So most of all the cones of the eye, so the color detecting receptors are found over here at the fovea, right? Most of them. Okay, what are we missing? So we also have the optic nerve, which transmits electrical impulses from the retina to the brain. And that's where the blind spot is, because I mentioned it does not have any receptors over there. So any light falling on the optic nerve is not going to be detected. Then you have the ciliary muscles, and these are the muscles. These muscles form a circular band around the lens and are involved in controlling the shape of the lens, right? So do not confuse ciliary muscles with circular muscles, right? The circular and radial muscles control the size of the pupil. The ciliary muscles control the size of, like the thickness of the lens. Okay. And then finally you have the suspensory ligaments, and these link the muscles to the lens and are also involved in controlling the shape of the lens. Okay, so with that, again, I look over here. So you've got the ciliary muscle, the suspensory ligaments. Now, right, with that, how do they function? What do they do? So the pupil reflex and then accommodation. So the pupil reflex is the change in the size of the pupil depending on what the light intensity is, right? So if the light intensity is high, it causes the contraction of the circular muscles, right? So the circular muscles are on the outside, and that causes the size of the pupil to reduce, right? If the light intensity is low, the circular muscles relax, right? So it's easy perhaps to study about only one of these. There's a pair of muscles, the circular and the radial muscles, right? So if you just know which one is which, So for high light intensity, the circular muscles contract and the pupil becomes smaller. For low light intensities, the circular muscles relax and the pupil becomes larger, allowing more light to enter. Now, what do we do? Okay, we're just talking about the circular muscles. What about the radial muscles? Right? These muscles are antagonistic. Antagonistic means that if one is contracting, the other is relaxing. Okay? So, just like during breathing, we talked about the external and internal intercostal muscles, right? One was relaxing, the other was contracting. So, we only talked about one. If you understand one, you can figure out the other, right? So, yeah. So, if you just put in your mind high light intensity, circular muscles contract, low light intensity, circular muscles relax. And so when the circular muscles are contracting, the radial muscles are relaxed. When the circular muscles are relaxed, the radial muscles are contracted. Okay?
Yes.
The change in the size of the pupil is automatic. You cannot control it consciously, right? So when high light intensity hits your eyes, it will automatically cause the pupils to contract. You cannot control it, consciously. And when there's low light, they will dilate, they will enlarge. Okay. Accommodation, so which is focusing, right? So when you are looking at objects and you're able to see them clearly, the 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 lens of the eye responds differently to objects that are close to you as compared to objects that are far away, right? So what that does, how that happens is that the lens changes. It becomes thin for distant objects, right? And it becomes thicker for objects that are nearby. So, right, when they're focusing on an image that is, for example, for the distance object becomes thinner and fatter for near objects. We just talked about that. And this happens by the contraction or the relaxation of the ciliary muscle, right? So when the ciliary muscle is relaxed, and there's something about humors, not humorous, humors and stuff, we don't need to know that. What that does is that when the ciliary muscles are relaxed, the lens is stretched to become thin. It refracts light less, and this is the accommodation for distant objects. So light coming in from distant. So there's an illustration to make this simpler, right? So this one, light is coming from a distant object. Okay, the ciliary muscles are relaxed, the lens is pulled thin, the light is refracted less, and it focuses on the retina. Now, if you're focusing on something that is nearby, the ciliary muscles contract. That allows the lens to become thick, which means it will refract the light more. There's more refraction, and so that will help the light to focus again on the retina, right? Why is it causing the light to refract more? Why? Because the light is coming from a nearby source and you need to quickly cause it to bend and focus on the retina, right? If it's not able to do that, or if a light is coming from a faraway source, if it's not able to focus it properly, and so, right, that is when you have conditions of the eye where you need correction glasses, right? And I believe we've talked about that in physics. Okay. So, right, any part of an image that is falling on the fovea, right? So, for example, you're looking at a window, and on the window there's a fly, and you're nearby and you're trying to focus. So, the whole window is being formed on your retina, but the fly over here, this tiny dot over here, it's being formed in the fovea. And because the fovea is the part of the retina that has the most cones, so color, and so that is the part of the image that is most in focus. You can see it in detail. It's very sharp for it. Everything else you kind of know is there, but it's not clearly in focus. It's not sharp. You can't see the details. So that's something. Now with that, we're done with the sense, like I mentioned, right? The only thing we're doing in sense organs is the eye. Since we have time, I want to cover hormones as well because it is not a detailed part of text, right? So it's just like 2 pages. And if you understand the concept, the rest is just examples and details. We'll cover hormones and then we'll leave homeostasis for next time. So, any questions about the eye?
Mhm.
Okay.
In the sense organ, only eye is included.
Huh?
In the sense organ part, only eye is included.
Yeah. Okay. So as you can see in the key definition, a hormone is a chemical substance produced by a gland and carried by the blood which alters activity of one or more specific target organs. Now, a number of things about this I've already told you, that the glands that secrete hormones are part of the endocrine system. They are ductless glands, they release it directly into the blood, and they have effects on controlling different parameters of the body, whether it's temperature or blood glucose or the osmotic pressure, so how much water there is in your blood, right? And so all of those are controlled by hormones. You can see over here in the illustration some different organs. So you've got the pituitary gland, no, not organs, sorry, glands, part of the endocrine system. You've got the pituitary gland over here. In your throat, you've got the thyroid gland, right? They haven't labeled that. You've got the pancreas where you get insulin from, and you've got the adrenal glands on top of the kidneys where you get your adrenaline from, and then you've got either the ovary or the testes, right? Depending on the person, obviously, right? And these produce sex hormones. So
So like all the hormones are carried by blood.
yes, all of them are carried by the blood. So over here is a nice table that's summarizing the differences, the features of the endocrine system and comparing it to the nervous system. So the mode of transmission of the nervous system is electrical impulses, whereas the endocrine system is chemicals, because hormones are chemicals. They can be either proteins or they can be steroids, which are basically lipids. Okay, so but chemicals nonetheless. Then transmission of in the nervous system is through the nerves, whereas in the endocrine system it is through the blood. The nervous system is very fast, so it's rapid transmission. The transmission through the blood is slow, obviously, because it's secreted, it goes to the blood, it travels to that part of the body. So compared to the nervous system, much slower. Right? For the nervous system, the impulse is sent directly to the target organ, whereas the hormone is dispersed throughout the body. So the effect is localized. They haven't mentioned this in the table. The effect from the nervous system is localized, whereas the effect of the endocrine system tends to be more widespread, right, compared to the nervous system. And finally, uh, the nervous system produces short-term effects, whereas the endocrine system can produce or does produce long-term effect again, right? So long-term comparatively, for example, they mentioned over here in the text, insulin, right, may stay in the bloodstream for just 4 to 8 hours before being broken down, right? So it stays and 4 to 8 hours is long term as compared to anything that the nervous system does, right? So long term effects. It can be much longer than that, obviously, especially the sex hormones and the growth hormones, right, have much longer long term effects. But even 4 to 8 hours is long for compared to the nervous system. Now,
And
yeah,
like hormones are present in our body before like the puberty.
hormones are present in our body. What?
Like before the puberty hit.
They're present before puberty, right? So you got
Yeah.
your thyroid hormone and other hormones. What happens at puberty is your sex hormones become activated, right? So
Okay.
testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, all of those become activated, and then they bring about what are called secondary sexual characteristics. So deepening of the voice for males, and broadening of of your structure and growth of facial hair and stuff for the women, right? For the females, uh, different sexual characteristics that develop later on in life, right? So those changes.
Okay.
Okay. Now, hormones, right, circulate on the body, in the blood, and eventually reach the target organs. They speed up, slow down, or alter the activity of these organs. Now, this is the part. After being secreted, hormones only remain temporarily in the blood. Once they do what they're supposed to do, they are changed by the liver into inactive compounds and then excreted by the kidneys. All right, so something you need to know. Right, they are processed in the liver, changed into inactive compounds, and then excreted. Okay.
Yes.
So they talk about digestive glands. I mentioned digestive glands have ducts, so they are not part of the endocrine system. Right, responses to the body to hormones are much slower. So we did that in the table. Many hormones affect long-term changes like growth rate, puberty, and pregnancy. Right, nerve impulses are limited. So, like I mentioned, they're pinpoint, whereas hormones can affect more than one organ, so it's more widespread. Achha. Deficiencies or excess of any hormone is not a good thing, right? And so that could cause illness. Slight differences between individuals and the hormone levels can cause individual differences, which are not necessarily a deficiency or an excess or a cause for an illness, right? So between myself and another person, our levels of hormones can most likely will be different. That doesn't mean that either one of us is suffering from a deficiency or an excess. It happens naturally, right? So they are
Because
they
the
are,
bodies,
huh?
because like the bodies are different. That's why.
Because they are,
Because like bodies are different. That's why.
yes, bodies, nutrition, conditions, health, lifestyle, all of those things, right? And many other factors. So what determines a deficiency and excess is the overall level. So obviously there are standards, there are ranges of how much a hormone should be, and so obviously, right, if your doctor ever gets one of your hormones tested, they have a reference range of what is the normal range, and then if it's below the normal, that's deficiency. If it's more than the normal, then that's an excess. Okay. Now with that, they are discussing a few like a few glands and hormones over here. So first of all, you've got the adrenal glands. They are attached to the kidney, right above the kidney, and they have obvious effects on the body, including the liver and heart. So they've outlined those over here. Right, in response to a stressful situation, nerve impulses are sent to the brain, from the brain to the adrenal gland, which releases adrenaline. So that's the name of the hormone, adrenaline, into the blood. Its presence, its presence causes breathing to become faster and deeper. This may be particularly clear as we pant for breath. Right, so in a stressful situation, not like when you're running. Okay, of course, when you're running, it does sort of get your adrenaline moving as well. So yeah, that's the thing. But there's more like of a physical response and need for respiration, more energy, and so more breathing, and so there are those factors as well. So adrenaline is called the fight or flight hormone. So mostly in stressful situations, the heart beats faster, resulting in increased pulse rate. This increase can be quite worrying. It makes us feel as if our heart is going to burst out of our chest. The pupils in our eyes dilate, making them look much blacker, and that is so that more light enters and we're able to focus better. In
What
the
is meant by diary?
dilated means the pupil becomes larger, enlarges.
Okay.
In the liver, it stimulates the conversion of glycogen to glucose. Right, this passes into the blood, and its increased concentration increases the heart rate. So you want more because you're in a stressful situation. You want more energy. Adrenaline has an important role in the control of metabolic activity, as you can imagine. Increased levels of glucose available to cells enable them to respire faster, making more energy available. Okay, so what we just mentioned. These effects all make us more able to react quickly and strongly in dangerous situations, and therefore those are known as fight or flight. So either you face the situation or you try to protect yourself and you run away, or you just try to protect yourself, right? Even if you can't actually run away. right? So when we might need to run away or put up with a struggle. However, in many stressful situations like taking examinations or giving a public performance, vigorous activity is not needed. So the extra adrenaline in our bodies just makes us feel tense or anxious. So it's not always like physical stress, it could be mental stress as well. That can also trigger adrenaline, and so that is where our anxiety comes from, right? The feeling of anxiousness. When adrenaline is no longer needed, it is quickly converted by the liver into a less active compound and excreted by the kidneys. So we talked about hormones in general, and that's what's happening over here as well. Then you got the pancreas. I mentioned the pancreas and the islets of Langerhans and producing insulin. All right, so the pancreas is a digestive gland that secretes enzymes into the duodenum through the pancreatic duct. We've covered that in an earlier chapter. It is also an endocrine gland. Most of the pancreatic cells produce digestive enzyme, but some of them produce hormones. Right? They are arranged in small isolated groups called islets. They secrete their hormones directly into the blood. One of the hormones is called insulin. It controls the level of glucose in the body, in the blood. By there's some text over here, yeah. By instructing the liver to remove sugars and store them, right? So it's converting glucose to glycogen in the liver. This happens when levels get too high, for example, after a meal rich in carbohydrates. So at iftar, right, there's a sudden rush of food into our body. So it's much more than we need immediately. And so there's a lot of glucose that's being converted to glycogen, right? Or amino acids and fats being converted and stored as well. The pancreas also produces another hormone called glucagon, right? This has the reverse effect. So glucagon is responsible for changing glycogen to glucose when the blood glucose level falls, right? So there's insulin and then there's glucagon. Insulin causes the conversion, it causes storage of excess glucose, so glucose to glycogen. Glucagon is the release of stored glucose, so glycogen to glucose. And do not confuse glucagon with glycogen. So just be careful because some of these names are close, and so we can confuse them. Glucagon is a hormone. Glycogen is carbohydrate. All right, almost done. The pituitary gland is attached to the base of the brain, so it's up there in the brain. It produces many hormones such as the pituitary releases into the blood follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH, which when it reaches the ovaries makes one of the follicles start to mature and produce estrogen. Estrogen is also a hormone, right? It is produced by the follicle. All right, so we'll talk about that in a later chapter. Then you got LH, or the luteinizing hormone, also known as lutropin. It is produced from the pituitary and together with the FSH. So you can use FSH if you don't remember follicle stimulating hormone or how to spell it. You can just write FSH, it is acceptable. You can also write LH, that is also acceptable. Right? And that stimulates ovulation. And so that again is going to come in chapter 16 later. And finally, you've got your reproductive organs. Right? These are the ovaries and the testes. And right, not only do they produce the gametes, which are the reproductive cells. So from the testes you get the sperm, from the ovaries you get the egg cells. Right? In the ovary, one of the hormones that's produced is estrogen. So you got that over here. We mentioned that. And what it does, it prepares the uterus for implantation of the embryo by making the lining thicker and increasing blood supply. Again, it might see like, what are they talking about? We'll come to that in chapter 16 in detail. They're just mentioning this happens. You've got this hormone and this is what it does. After ovulation, the ovary, right? So what's ovulation? Again, we'll get to that in that chapter, so we'll talk about it then. The ovary produces progesterone, so that's a different hormone. And while progesterone levels remain high, the lining of the uterus is maintained, and so it's ready for implantation and then the growth of the embryo and then the fetus and then the baby. As far as the testes are concerned, they produce testosterone, and estrogen. Sorry, no, right? They produce testosterone and right estrogen from the ovaries, and these play a part in the development of secondary sexual characteristics, which I mentioned, right? I mentioned estrogen because right males have primarily testosterone, but they have some low levels of female hormones as well, so estrogen and stuff. And
So
women,
like the man who has estrogens
very low levels. Obviously they don't have ovaries, they don't have the female organ, but they do produce very low levels of the female hormone, right?
so like their linings also
Huh?
so like their lining also thickens and
For
because of the estrogens.
men don't have linings, beta. Their organs are completely different. Okay, right? Just because like the function is different in men. Okay,
But like, the man hormone and like females like you make like a effect, no? Estrogens. Active.
yeah. So the effect in the female body is different, right? I mentioned that, and so if it's causing confusion, forget that, right? I was just saying because on slip of the tongue, I mentioned that men also have estrogen, but they have like right that's not what they're saying. But it's like there are low levels, right? Women also have some low level of testosterone in them. Okay,
Okay.
so they do have the male hormone as well. What its function is, right? That's a separate matter. So obviously, its function is not what it does in men, right?
Yeah.
So don't confuse that. So focus on testosterone in men, estrogen in women, right? And
Yeah.
development of secondary sexual characteristics. So that's what you need to know.
Yeah.
Okay, and with that, I'll end class. Right, we can talk about homeostasis the next time and actually complete this chapter. So we'll finally be done with chapter 14, and then we can move on to obviously the next one. Any questions?
No.
Okay, so I will see you after Eid then. All right, Allah.